Great. So, hello, I'm Ralph Martire. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. If you don't know that organization, we are a bipartisan nonprofit. So I have Democrats and Republicans on my board that don't like or trust each other at all. And that's great for us at the staff because we focus on best practices and data. So what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to run through some data pretty quickly, is where we are in school funding under our new evidence-based funding formula and what the prospects are for full funding and how effective the legislation's been. And I don't think you could really have a conversation about school funding in Illinois without understanding our state budget, where it is, and what it would take to get the state to actually have the fiscal capacity to fully fund this model. So what you have in front of you right here is the FY 2023 enacted general fund budget. Our state is on a fiscal year. It ends on June 30th. So fiscal year 2023 actually starts this July 1st. You go to the top line there, it says gross general fund appropriations. That's the total amount they're going to spend in their general fund this year. It's 46.6 billion. We break those expenditures down into their main component parts. So the first is what we call hard costs. These are things the state has to pay either by law or by contract. There's no discretion. They don't vote on whether or not to do this. They just figure out how much they owe. There's just a few items in there. There's like debt service to things like banks and bondholders. There's the pension contribution, which is the subject of a continuing appropriation. That just means there's a statute that says how much has to go in every year. There are other similar statutory transfers out for things like Medicaid funds, et cetera. And go back to that slide because we weren't quite done with it.
Oh, sorry.
Back.
Well, I don't know what's happening.
We're going forward. There we are. Groovy. And then a group health insurance, which is just the health insurance the state owes on its workers. The next column of main expenditures are gross general fund service appropriations. That's what the state has some discretion on, and that's where the state spends its money on core services. And you could see I bracketed out 95% of those expenditures really just go to four things: education, healthcare, human services, and public safety. So the state is actually spending our money pretty much the way we want it to be spent, and it has really high regard for, I guess, what voters would like to see happen with investments in core services. Other, by the way, which is just $1.4 billion, is literally everything else state government does. So it's economic development, it's environmental protection, it's the parks, it's central management services, it's the constitutional officers. So really in that final 5%, there's a lot crammed. And the bottom line is the state is a very efficient organization when it comes to spending our money. We don't really have a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse in the budget, even though this is Illinois, and you would assume that would be the case. All right, next slide, please. So how big is our current deficit? And the answer is it's about $4.5 billion. And I'm going to run through this very quick. So go to the top line there. You see 49 billion is what the anticipated revenue for fiscal year 2023. It's record revenue. We've had some unanticipated revenue come in. I'll get into that in a slide or two. But they have record revenue this year. Now, out of that revenue, they have to pay for the hard costs, those things that the state has to fund by contract or by law. That's 14.5 billion. So take that right out. That leaves 32 billion to spend on services, which sounds good because they're going to spend about that amount on services. The problem is in public sector accounting, they don't have to make any sort of inclusion of a carry forward deficit that remains from the end of the prior fiscal year. And so the end of fiscal year 2022, it's projected the state's going to have a deficit of just under 6 billion. You can see here $5.999 billion. And under state law, they have to pay this deficit off before the end of the next year. And it's really unpaid bill. This is money that was allocated to spend on services in the current fiscal year that they didn't have the revenue to cover. So now they're going to use money out of next fiscal year to pay for the bills that accrued. That leaves only 26 billion in revenue to fund current services. They are going to spend 30, meaning the deficit's going to be reduced because they're spending a little bit less, but it's still going to be $4.5 billion or 15% of what the state is spending on education, health, social services, and public safety happens to be deficit spending. We don't have the current revenue to cover those expenditures. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So we've had a lot of help from the federal government in our fiscal system over the last few years for the various relief programs under the CARES Act and the ARPA Act designed to help state and local government muddle through the pandemic. And you could see that the amount of money that we've gotten from the federal government has increased steadily through this year, fiscal year 2022, to where it's in excess of $6 billion, although not all of that's going into our general fund this year. About $2.7 billion of that is being used to support our unemployment insurance system, which had a lot of claims made on it during the pandemic. They've budgeted just over $1 billion and change of federal dollars for the current fiscal year, and then look at fiscal year 2024. There's nothing. And so this federal relief, which has been really helpful and has assisted Illinois in getting through the pandemic, is going away, and that's going to create a fiscal cliff. Now, I did mention, next slide, please. I did mention that the state had unanticipated revenue growth this year, and it really did, and it was significant. It was about $4.6 billion. And here's how that money is going to be used. They're basically taking the $4.6 billion in excess revenue from the current fiscal year, FY 2022, and spending it over 2 years, some this year, most of it this year, and some next year in 2023. And you can see the different lines in here. The pension stabilization funds, that just means they're prepaying pension debt that they don't have to pay yet. There's property tax relief. There's one-time income tax relief. They're actually making some deposits into the state's rainy day fund, which is a good thing. Illinois was the only state in America that had a zero balance in its rainy day fund. No money to tide us through bad times. That happened under Governor Rauner. He completely zeroed out our rainy day fund, and they never were able to get more money back into it until they had this unanticipated revenue. And then they are going to spend a little bit more on current services this year. You can see $487 million. And then they're going to pay some bills that they owed. And if you just go to the little bottom little paragraph that I put in there, this really breaks down what they're doing with that excess revenue. Of the $4.6 billion, 35% is just going to pay existing obligations the state already has. 31% is going into tax relief for constituents across the state. 22% is building the rainy day fund, and only 10% is actually being used for new spending on services. So they were very fiscally responsible with this. I would argue that the tax relief was probably something they didn't need to do, that they could have done more targeted tax relief focused on low-income families. But the bottom line is they did what they did. At least it's this one-time tax relief, but they didn't take this new one-time bump in revenue, which is not expected to continue, and included in covering a bunch of ongoing operating costs that were expanded. So they didn't grow the deficit. They didn't really expand services. They were somewhat fiscally responsible. Next slide. All of which means that by fiscal year 2026, just a couple of years from now, we're going to be facing a really big fiscal cliff, and it's going to be somewhere in the $6 to $8 billion range. That's when all the federal money will be gone. They'll have no more ARPA or CARES Act revenue to use to support the general fund, and that one-time spike in revenue we're seeing this year will have gone back to normal revenue generation. So instead of seeing, that $4.6 billion in one-time revenue spike, our revenue growth will go back to more around the $1.5 billion range, meaning we're going to have a big deficit that's going to require some action to fill. They're going to have to replace the $2 to $4 billion in annual spending that's been covered by federal transfers and reduce or eliminate the state's structural deficit. What is that? I hear you all clamor. I hear no one clamor that, but I like to say that. The next slide, please. The structural deficit is something that just is a model of whether or not the state's current revenue policy, its tax policy, is sufficient to support its current level of spending on services, plus pay off its existing debt going forward. Now, we've developed this model, and I don't like to use a lot of models in my presentations, because anyone out there with a stats background knows that if your model, your assumptions can jury rig your outcomes. You can do really manipulative things with a model. And we like to do something I call simple math, just use publicly available data sets so everyone can check our math. But to project going forward, you need a model. This model's been peer reviewed by 4 different independent PhD economists, including the head of state and local tax analysis for the GAO in Washington, DC. It's not only passed peer review, we've been using it at CTBA for about 18 years now, and we've accurately predicted the growth in the state's deficit within 1%. It's a pretty good model. So let's go to fiscal year 2022, which is the far left-hand column there. If the state had an honestly balanced budget in this current fiscal year, its revenue and expenditures were equal. The red line shows you how its revenues are anticipated to grow going forward. And the bluish gray line shows you how its costs are expected to grow going forward, adjusting solely for historic rates of inflation, assuming a normal economy, and assuming no changes in law. So what you could see is revenue growth will not continue to support the same level of investment in current services that's being made today, and continue to pay off our debt. And that's if we started with an honestly balanced budget. You all now know we don't have an honestly balanced budget. We have a budget that has a $4 billion plus deficit in it. So really you could move that revenue line down by 4 billion to get a feel for where our actual fiscal condition is. And the technical fiscal term for that is not pretty. It is not a pretty fiscal condition. So there's been 2 consequences of this: high property taxes and unfunded pension liabilities. Why is that the case? Well, the only way to solve a structural deficit politically is to either cut your spending down to your revenue line every year. In Illinois, that means cutting education, health, social services, and public safety every single year. You don't get reelected if you come back to your constituents every year and say, hey, guess what I did for our community? I cut spending on education. I cut healthcare. I cut, in funding for taking care of abused and neglected kids. It's just not a happy message to bring back to your constituents. And believe it or not, the other way to solve the problem, raising your revenue so that you actually have adequate fiscal capacity to fund services, is also somewhat politically difficult to do. Who would know that a tax increase was difficult? So because these are politically difficult things to do, politicians in Illinois, and this is bipartisan and it's gone on for decades, so there's no one party to blame for this, decided to do 2 things. Number one, simply not pay into the pensions what was owed. Take the money that was owed to the pensions to cover the cost of the benefits being earned by public sector workers, and instead of funding that, use that money to hide some of the structural deficit and continue funding services, then just write an IOU to the pension system, say we'll pay you back later with interest at some time. In other words, borrowing to spend, effectively using the pension systems like a credit card. The other thing they did was they said, hey, guess what? Local property taxes fund K-12 education too. Let's just not put enough money in from the state and force those locals to put a lot more in from local revenue, property taxes in particular, to fund K-12 education. That was another way to hide the structural deficit. And then so money that wasn't being invested in K-12 was available to invest in healthcare or social services or public safety. So that's why we have high property taxes in Illinois, that meaning the structural deficit. It's also why we have a big unfunded pension liability. Now, one question I always get is, wait a minute, Ralph, did runaway spending on services cause this structural deficit? Let me think about it. No. So go to the next slide, please. And as you can see in this next slide, and I'm just going to highlight the data here really quickly, we are comparing spending in fiscal year 2000, if you go to the far left, to the current budget. All we do is adjust for inflation. So if you look at that column on the far left, that's how much money we actually put into education, health, social services, and public safety in fiscal year 2000 under Republican Governor George Ryan. The next column, right next to it, adjusts that investment for inflation. So in current dollars, just you look at the top line for ease of reference, the 4.6 billion that we put into K-12 education in fiscal year 2000 is the equivalent of 8.8 billion today. They buy the same amount of services. That's an inflation adjusted number. Those are equal terms. The third column is what the budget is this year for the different items, so what they are going to expend. And the last two columns are whether or not we're spending more or less after you adjust for inflation in real terms. If you go to the very bottom far right corner, today, 23 years later, we are going to spend 19.7% less collectively on education, health, social services, and public safety than we did back in the year 2000. There's just never been any evidence to indicate that spending on services is driving the structural deficit. It has always been a problem caused by bad tax policy. Now, there's two areas where we have increased spending. K-12 education. That is up by all of 3%, 3.5% in real terms in 23 years. That's nothing to write home about. But I'll tell you what, if we hadn't passed the evidence-based funding model into law, that wouldn't be up at all. That number would be negative. All the growth in K-12 funding has happened since the evidence-based funding formula has been passed, because in that formula, there are two funding metrics included for enhancing K-12 funding every year. The first metric says the state should, doesn't have to, but should increase K-12 funding by $300 million in nominal terms over and above the prior year, every year, until it fully funds the model. Now, they've done that every year. The EBF has been law passed in fiscal year 2018, except for one, fiscal year 2021, they flat funded education. But every other year, they put that 300 million more in. And that's the reason why we are up by 3%. Without that, the state would be way in the hole on K-12. Early childhood funding is up by 85% in real terms. That's the good news. But go to the FY 2023 column. We're going to invest $598 million in early childhood education this year. That's really good. And that investment is one that pays off. It's got a high rate of return for taxpayers. It's a really positive thing to do. It's a real equitable thing to do. The problem is, even though we've made this commitment and a strong commitment to enhancing our investment, the actual demand for early childhood services in Illinois exceeds $3.4 billion. So great, we are putting more in. That's a good thing. The bad news is we're not coming anywhere near meeting need. And everything else has been cut significantly. Higher ed down by 45% in real terms. That's why tuition costs at public universities in Illinois are so high. Next slide, please. So I did say that one of the consequences of that structural deficit was our unfunded pension liability. And it's big. It's over 120 billion with a B dollars. And in 1995, under Governor Edgar and some guy named Speaker Madigan, I don't know if you remember him, he at one point in time was kind of influential in the Democratic Party. Speaker Madigan and Edgar got together and they passed what was called the pension ramp. It's called that because they created a 50-year payment plan to get the pension systems in Illinois healthy and to pay back what had been diverted from going into the pension systems to hide the structural deficit and cover current service expenditures, basically paying back the pension debt. Now that 50-year plan is what's left of it is laid out here. And you add these two bars together every year, and you could see that's the amount the state is scheduled to put in to its pension systems. I broke the payments down into their component parts. The blue bar at the bottom is the actual cost of funding the pension benefits being earned by state workers, including, by the way, downstate teachers. That's the teachers' retirement system is included in there. So that's the cost of funding benefits. The red bar is the cost of paying back the debt that the state ran up the unfunded liability to its pension systems. You look at that red bar, and that's what's killing the state. The bottom line is that ramp, that ski slope looking ramp, was never intended to be funded. It was a boondoggle passed in 1995 where they completely backloaded the payments, knowing that somewhere down the road the state was going to have to change this. But for the first 15 or 20 years of the ramp, they designed the payment schedule so that they just continued the practice of borrowing against what was owed to the systems, drove up the amount of debt owed to the systems, and now we're in the period where that debt's actually being paid back. There's no way, I actually teach a master's course on economic and fiscal policy that includes tax policy at Roosevelt University. I can't design a tax system that the revenue grows like this pension ramp debt service grows. The last few years, the debt service growth has outstripped revenue growth in the state's general fund, except for this year when we had that unexpected growth. So next slide, please. That pension ramp is getting in the way of the state having the capacity to actually fund the evidence-based funding formula fully. So this is a rational way to solve the problem. Put a little bit more money in up front and then level out your payments. So that red line you see squiggling across your screen, that's the pension ramp. That's what you just saw on the prior slide. The gray bars are the new repayment of that pension ramp after putting a little bit more money in up front and changing the timing of the payments. The difference, the pension ramp promises to get the systems to the point where in 2045, they have 90% of their liabilities covered with assets. We say, the law is, or at least the standard is created by the General Accounting Office in Washington, D.C., is that a public system only has to be 80% funded. If we went to 80% funded and we went to level dollar and we put more money in up front, guess what? We save $55 billion in debt service costs. We get the systems healthy, and we don't have to raise taxes to charge people $55 billion of covered wasted debt. And we don't have to cut services up to that $55 billion to just cover this crazy debt service cost. And if you wanted to get 100% funded in 30 years after 2045, you can do that very easily and at a much lower annual cost. So the bottom line is we need to save this money. We need to re-amortize the pension debt. And the good news is our system actually makes the pension systems healthier than the ramp does, faster. The ramp passes us out in about year 2039, but before that, we actually get the systems healthier. Yes, Governor Pritzker is considering re-amortizing the debt, as are a number of legislators. We talk to them all the time. Next slide, please. I also said the structural deficit created an incentive for the state to kick the primary obligation of fund K-12 education away from state taxes and down to local property taxes. So I thought I would back that up with data. So this is the portion of K-12 funding covered by state, federal, and local resources. Illinois in red, the blue being the national average. So if you go to the far left, the Fed's covered just about 7% of all K-12 funding nationally now, mostly through Title I, some IDEA money, some transportation money, et cetera. Then the middle comparison is the portion of K-12 funding paid for by state taxes, like the income and sales. You can see national averages for a state to cover 46.8, almost 47% of the cost of K-12 education. In Illinois, we only cover 32.8, 33%. That's 50th. Illinois ranks dead last in the nation in the portion of K-12 funding paid for by state taxes. Then you go to the last comparison on the far right, local property taxes on average cover 45% of the cost of K-12 funding across the country, but in Illinois, they cover 60%. That is first. We rank first in reliance on property taxes to fund K-12. We are the outlier in both cases. Now, the good news is that the design of the evidence-based funding formula is to change this and to push the primary obligation away from property taxes into the state for funding K-12 education. The bad news is because of the structural deficit and that pension ramp, there's no way state's actually going to be able to live up to its obligation to shift this responsibility and assume the primary obligation to fund schools anytime soon. So next slide, please. Relying on property taxes isn't just a terrible way to fund education. I mean, obviously, it ties the quality of education a student is going to receive to the property wealth of the community in which the kid lives. So we're fortunate in the Oak Park and River Forest communities to have really high property values and have a lot of property wealth that generates revenue to fund a pretty quality education for our kids. Just step out to Maywood or Bellwood or Austin and communities right around us that don't have any property taxes, right? Their schools really don't have anywhere near the capacity we have. And that's one of the inequities you see from over relying on property taxes to fund schools. Second thing that's bad about over relying on property taxes is it's a lousy way to tax people. So here's some information that I think really drives that home. The blue bar shows you that since 1990, after you take out inflation, so this is in inflation adjusted real terms, property taxes in Illinois have grown by almost 70%. Median income, on the other hand, the red bar, has grown by 11%. Our property tax burden is growing by 6 to 7 times the rate of growth of income for most people. That's not sustainable. It's not fair. And it may be why constituents occasionally get a little concerned about the property tax bills they're seeing from their school districts. That said, school districts haven't had a lot of choice in how they're going to fund their operations because the state hasn't put in enough money. Now, the evidence-based funding formula gives us a vehicle where that will become possible if we get the state's capacity up to the point where it can fund it. Finally, next slide, please, on the property tax thing. I would just point out, it's not just a lousy way to tax people, it's a lousy way to tax businesses. So this is a study done annually by Ernst & Young, the big accounting firm, and this is Illinois specific data, by the way, and it shows the breakdown of the taxes paid by Illinois businesses to state and local authorities in Illinois. And by far and away, the biggest tax paid by businesses is the property tax. Almost 46% of all taxes businesses pay is the property tax. Go to about the middle of the graphic, you'll see corporate income taxes are only 4%. Obviously, shifting some corporate tax burden away from their property tax and to the income tax is really good for businesses for a couple of reasons. The primary reason is a property tax is a fixed cost. It's something a business has to pay whether or not it's making money. The corporate income tax is something a business pays only after it's profitable. So after it's earned back all of its expenses for, labor and supplies and R&D and et cetera. So the bottom line is it's a better way to tax businesses and getting rid of this over-reliance on property taxes to fund schools, a better way to tax people, more equitable way to fund education, only possible if the state of Illinois gets to the point where it could adequately fund the evidence-based formula from state-based resources. So next slide. So how about that evidence-based formula? Well, I told you it had 2 different funding metrics in it. The first was every year the state is supposed to increase K-12 funding by about $300 million over the prior year in nominal dollars. But the second is it creates a target. It said that the state should fully fund the evidence-based formula on an inflation-adjusted basis within 10 years of its initiation. So the legislation became effective in fiscal year 2018, which means by fiscal year 2027, it's supposed to be fully funded. Not happening. If, in fact, the state continues to put in $300 million a year every year, that second line, new funding over and above the prior year, it will take till fiscal year 2043 to fully fund the evidence-based formula, meaning we're going to lose a couple more generations of children to an underfunded K-12 system, and it's going to take another couple of generations to reduce the over-reliance on property taxes that we have in funding K-12. Next slide, please. If we really wanted to get this model funded by fiscal year 2027, we'd have to increase that $300 million that's going in new money every year to $1.183 billion. If we did that, So basically more than tripling the amount that's going in. We could actually get this model fully funded by fiscal year 2027 as initially intended, and not lose generations of children to an underfunded system. So we really want to do that. And we really want to do that for a number of reasons. And if you're curious, this year, once again, even though they had that record revenue, they're going to put in the $300 million more over the prior year. So they're staying right with their old formula as things stand today. Next slide, please. The way the evidence-based funding formula works is it identifies about 30 elements, about 25 or 26 of which are evidence or research-based, and the rest are standard school cost-based. So it identifies these 30 elements it takes to run a school. The non-evidence-based things are like, what's it cost to keep the building clean, those kinds of things. The evidence-based elements of the bill are, okay, these are the educational practices that have a statistically meaningful correlation to enhancing student outcomes. And when I say student outcomes, I don't just mean test scores, although test scores are included. I mean reducing dropout rates, increasing graduation rates, reducing disciplinary rates, increasing college matriculation rates, increasing college graduation rates. Basically, all the outcomes you want to be generating from a K-12 educational system. And it funds them based on the unique demographics of each school district. Once that funding amount is determined for each school district, called its adequacy target, all the school districts are separated into tiers for purposes of receiving evidence-based funding under the bill. These tiers prioritize those school districts that are furthest away from their adequacy target. So if you're a tier 1 school district, right now you have about 63% or less of what the evidence-based model indicates you need to provide a quality education to the students you serve. If you're tier 2, and if the model's dynamic, if you're tier 2, you have somewhere between wherever tier 1 cuts off and 90% of what the evidence indicates you need to fund a quality education for your kids. If you're tier 3, you have between 90 and 100% of what the model indicates you need. And if you are tier 4, you are over 100% funded. I sit on the board of D200. We are a tier 4 school district. We have more than what the evidence indicates we need. We are about 129% funded, I think, last I looked. So we have more than what we need. So the way the model prioritizes funding is, of the new money that goes in every year, 50% goes to tier 1. Those school districts that are furthest away from having what they need, 50% of the new money. The next 49% of the new money is shared between tier 1 and tier 2. So tier 1 gets 2 bites at the apple, right? The model tries to get rid of tier 1 as quickly as it can. Tier 3 districts, which have between 90 and 100% of what the evidence indicates they need, get 0.9% of the new money, and 0.1% goes to tier 4 districts. Now, why is the cutoff 90% for really sharing in the new money as opposed to 100%? And the answer is federal funding. So federal funding is not included in anything I just talked about. So if you're at 90% or 92% of your adequacy target between your state and local money, you add in the federal money, which is 7.5% every year, you're pretty close to 100% funded. So that's really why the resources are driven to tier 1 districts. You can see by this map, we started with having 50% of the school districts in Illinois in tier 1, half. After funding for a number of years, the law has been in effect since 2018, that's gone down a little. It's gone down to 49%. It actually bumped up and then went down. And so if you look at total student enrollment, 49% of our kids are still in districts that have 63% or less of the resources they need to fund the children being served. Next slide, please. So this is how the new money has gone in. And I told you it favors tier 1. They get 2 bites at the apple. So in 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2022, that big orange bar, that's the amount of the new money that went to tier one. You can see it's well over 80% of the new money every single year. That kind of really sickly yellow-green color, that's tier two. And you can see the rest of the funding over that tier three and tier four barely visible. So the money's gone where we want it to go under the model. Next slide, please. We can see that adequacy, average adequacy by tier, has gone up for virtually every tier over time. Now, you see some weird numbers. Let's say the tier two funding between 2021 and 2022, it actually went down. They went from 77% funded to 76, but recall in 2021, no new money went in. So that accounts for that decline. Same with tier one, but you could also see that there's been a steady climb up when the money is going in. So the money is doing exactly what we want it to do. It's going to the districts that need it. It's getting them a higher funded level. It's giving them the resources, more of the resources they need to educate the children they serve. Next slide, please. So the number of districts in Illinois that have less than 60% of what the research indicates they need has dropped dramatically. When the bill was first funded in 2018, 168 school districts out of the 854 or so actually had less than 60% of the resources they needed, according to the evidence. We're now down to just 16 school districts at such a low funded level. This is just more evidence that the model is really working the way we want it to work. So let's look at the adequacy gap by region. Next slide, please. So sometimes, when you talk about numbers in the billions, they get hard to follow. This is a lot easier to follow. This is the per pupil funding gap by region across Illinois. So if you look at CPS, by far and away, the largest funding gaps per pupil are in CPS. They were at $5,500 per kid in 2018. They've been reduced somewhat. They're at $5,494 today. Suburban Cook, not including CPS, that's declined from a gap of $4,126 per student in 2018 down to $3,845 by this fiscal year. Collar counties, you can see there's been a decline. Downstate, there's been a decline. So the money is closing that per pupil funding gap all across the state. So it's equitable from a geographic standpoint in how it's being distributed. Next slide, please. Here's the per pupil adequacy gap by tier. And what you can see is obviously tier one has the largest per pupil funding gaps in the state. They've gone down somewhat from $5,534 per kid down to $5,230, but still significant. And then you see tier three, tier two, and tier four. Tier four actually has a surplus per kid. Next slide, please. The other thing that we now know, because we couldn't figure this out under our old formula, but we absolutely have the data with the new formula, is the racial gap and ethnic gap in funding. And this is really, telling. If you go to the far left, and this is just for students attended underfunded schools. So we didn't add in those school districts that were in tier four that had more money than they need, because that would distort the numbers. So the average white kid attending an underfunded school in Illinois in fiscal year 2018 had a funding gap of $3,680 per pupil. That is now down to $3,653. It was down much further than that last year, but the 1 year of non-funding really hurt. Then you look at the Black and Latinx funding gaps per pupil, far greater. So the typical Black student that was attending an underfunded school in 2018 saw a per pupil funding gap of $5,063 per kid. That is now down to $4,813. Typical Latinx student funding gap of $5,167 back in 2018, now down to $4,892 per pupil. So from an equity standpoint, whether you're talking about geographic distribution, income-based distribution, or racial ethnic distribution, what you're seeing is the evidence-based model is actually reducing the gaps in funding equitably across the board, no matter how you slice it. It really has been a very effective way to distribute resources into K-12 funding. Next slide. So this just shows you how much funding has been received, the new funding, the 300 million or so that's put in every year by race and ethnicity every year. What you see here is you add together what's going to the Black and Latinx communities, and you're seeing that their funding is greater than what's going to a white student. And that makes sense given the distribution of white students in adequately funded schools to the distribution of Black and Latinx students in adequately funded schools. It's very disproportionately favors white students. So poor white students are still getting a major investment being made in them, but the gap in funding, the structurally racist school funding system we had before that created a much larger funding gap for your typical Black or Latinx kid, is being redressed by the new allocation of resources under the evidence-based funding formula. Next slide, please. So just to take all those numbers and to put it into one simple thing for you, 89% of the new funding has gone to schools educating 73% of all our Black children and 70% of all our Latinx kids. And in 2018, 168 districts had resources that were less than 60% of their adequacy target. That's down to 16 districts. So that's the good news. Here's the bad news. We need $4.4 billion to get to the finish line. And given that structural deficit and the existing pension ramp, there's no way the state's current fiscal system is going to get us there. So what do we need to do? Well, I've already said we need to re-amortize that pension debt. That's a simple thing. That's a change in law. We need to be on all our legislators to support doing that. And the legislation changes, and we save 50 billion plus between now and 2045. And that frees up a lot of money to fund education. But we're still going to need new revenue to eliminate that structural deficit I showed you. So how do we get there? Next slide, please. There's a couple of things we need to do. We have to increase our flat rate income tax. Now, unfortunately, Illinois had the opportunity to go to a graduated rate on its income tax. It passed the General Assembly, but it had to be ratified by voters because it required a constitutional amendment, and voters didn't ratify it. So if that had become law, it would have generated $3.6 billion in new revenue for the state, all of which would have been paid by the wealthiest 3% of taxpayers in Illinois. And if you're wondering who they are people that are single, filing individually with $250,000 a year or more in taxable income, or married filing jointly with $500,000 a year of taxable income, filing jointly. And that is taxable income. So that's after you take out deductions and credits, et cetera. But it didn't pass. So how would we get that $3.6 billion with our current tax policy? Well, it's a flat tax. So our current rate is 4.95%. If we increase that by 1 percentage point, we would generate the $3.6 billion and replace the revenue that we didn't get from the failure of the fair tax. The problem with that is about 1.1 billion of this 3.6 billion will be paid by individuals who have $75,000 or less every year in taxable income. That happens to be 4.9 million of the 6.3 million taxpayers in Illinois, 78%. And we don't want to really tax them a lot more, given 80% of the jobs that we've lost so far during the pandemic have been jobs in the bottom 2 wage quintiles, and that's where these people are. Illinois already has one of the most unfair and regressive taxing systems in all of America, while virtually all real income growth in our state has gone, in the last 40 years, by the way, to the wealthiest 1%. So to take care of that problem, if instead of just increasing our flat rate by 1%, we increased it by 1.5%. So it went from 4.95 to 6.45. And then we put in place a refundable tax credit targeted at folks with taxable incomes of $75,000 a year or less, we could completely eliminate the impact of this tax increase on those 4.9 million folks with taxable incomes at $75,000 a year or less, while still raising 3.6 billion in new revenue. And that's about what we need to raise from the income tax. So part of the problem is solved. And if you go to the next slide, this just shows you income distribution in Illinois over the last 40 years. And unfortunately, something got lost in the translation when I sent it over. So what this is a comparison from 1979 to 2018. And the orange bar shows average income for the wealthiest 1% in 1979, which was about $464,000 a year. And then it shows you what it was in 2018 after adjusted for inflation. So in real terms, their average income jumped to 1.8 million, a 254% increase. For everyone else, the bottom 99%, their average incomes went up from 58,000 to 70,000 over this period, an increase of just 20%. And I will note that the bottom 90% in Illinois were actually earning less after inflation in 2017 than in 1979. So this is just the data. This is Illinois specific data that really drives home the case that we should try to build some tax fairness into our tax policy. Having a flat rate income tax makes that impossible to do with your rate structure. But if we included this refundable credit, we could get some good things done. Next slide, please. All right, so we also need to expand our sales tax base to include services. And the reason for that is of the 45 states with sales tax, Illinois taxes less of the modern economy than any of the other states. And that's because our sales tax applies primarily to the sale of goods, not the sale of services. I think this graphic makes it very clear why that's a loser proposition. Go to the far left. Back in 1965, sale of goods, what we do tax, which is represented by the orange line, was 40% of all economic activity in Illinois, while the sale of services was 51%, the yellowy green line. Now, fast forward to 2016, the most recent full data I have, sale of goods had declined to be just 17% of our Illinois economy, while sale of services jumped to 73%. You just can't leave excuse me, the largest and fastest growing segment of your economy out of your tax base and expect your revenue to grow with the economy. You're not taxing the economy. If you go to the next slide, please, you'll see that we tax fewer services with our sales tax than any of our neighboring states in the Midwest, including Iowa and Wisconsin. And in fact, Iowa and Wisconsin tax all the services we think you should tax. And what services are those? Consumer services. So not business to business, not healthcare, not professional, not financial. Literally things like bowling and lawn care and haircuts. And when you go in and get your car repaired, you pay sales tax on the parts, not on the labor. You'd pay it on the labor now. And that's what Iowa and Wisconsin tax. If we were to tax what Iowa and Wisconsin taxes, we would generate about $2 billion in new revenue. And that's shown by the next slide. And that $2 billion coupled with the 3.6 billion raised on the income tax, coupled with the re-amortization of the pension debt, gets Illinois' structural deficit to be completely gone, allows full funding of the evidence-based model by 2027. And by the way, we keep Illinois still a relatively low tax state. Right now, if you look at total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income, Illinois, which has the 6th largest population and 5th largest economy of any state, ranks about 33rd, 34th in total state and local tax burden. And that includes every tax and every fee charged by any unit of government in our state versus any tax or fee charged by any unit of government in each other state as a percentage of income. After these tax increases, obviously we would go up, but we'd go up to about 26th or 27th. So we'd still be bottom half in tax burden, despite having the 6th largest population, the 5th largest economy. So we would not be high taxed. And local governments would also benefit if we expanded the sales tax base. Now, one of the arguments always made against that is, oh, people will go elsewhere to consume their service, blah, 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 blah. We'll lose business to the neighboring states. Well, first of all, we can't, because our neighboring states already tax these services. But my question for everyone is always, gee, do you see busloads of people from Iowa and Wisconsin coming to Illinois to get their haircut? You don't. But yet they tax haircuts in Iowa and Wisconsin, and we don't. Now, if you've seen their haircuts, they probably should start coming, but it's not for tax reasons. It would purely be for enhancing their general look. Now, go to my final slide. One of the comments that people always make is, well, if you increase taxes, you'll hurt the economy, and isn't cutting taxes a way to stimulate the economy? And I just thought I would include for you, we've got a full report on this, and I encourage everyone to go to CTBA's website and pull up our report on supply side economics. But the bottom line is tax cuts, particularly supply side trickle down tax cuts, have never stimulated the economy. And in fact, tax increases can happen while the economy goes well. There's no statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and economic growth. And I'll just give you some of these findings because they're compelling. And you all know what trickle-down tax cuts are. You cut taxes, particularly on businesses and wealthy people, frees up enough of their income to invest in savings in their businesses, that they create jobs for everyone else. That's the trickle-down effect. And that will so stimulate the economy, it'll grow much faster rates than it has before. Has never worked in any industrialized nation that has tried it. That is not my conclusion. That is the conclusion of the London School of Economics, which looked at the literal 18 OECD nations, including the US, that have implemented supply sides over the last 50 years, found that the impact of those cuts on the economy is statistically indistinguishable from zero. That actually mirrors findings the Congressional Research Service did when it looked at federal tax policy over a longer period of time, 65 years, and it looked at both tax increases and tax cuts. And what they found was whether the federal government raised or cut taxes, and they include corporate income taxes, individual income taxes, capital tax rates, that raising or cutting these taxes was not correlated with economic growth, with savings, with investment or productivity growth. Top tax rates appear to have little or no relation to the size of the economic pie, period. So I throw all that out there to say we have a great school funding formula in Illinois now. It's really working to make investments in the students that need it most. It's redressing all the inequities created by the old system, whether the inequities were by income, geography, race, or ethnicity, but the state literally doesn't have the fiscal capacity to fund it adequately. We need to get that fiscal capacity done. It's an easy lift from a policy standpoint. It's a difficult lift from a political standpoint, and hopefully we can encourage our elected officials to support making the changes needed to get home and solve these problems. That is the end of the presentation, and I am happy to take any questions anyone has. Hearing none, I will leave. No, I'm kidding.
Would the re-amortization cover close that gap, that funding gap?
Yeah, it helps. It helps significantly. It's one of the key things we need to do.
We have heard your presentation. Those of us in the Ralph Martire fan club have known about the re-amortization model for years, and so I'm thrilled to hear that it's being serious. Is it being seriously considered? What's the we almost got it done, Teresa, under Rauner the last year he was in office. We had 15 Republicans. This is all being done behind the scenes. 15 Republicans, about 35 Democrats. Governor Rauner was supporting it. And at the last minute, he pulled his support. And so when he pulled his support, we lost all the Republicans. And then the Democrats were like, well, we can't get this done on a straight Democratic vote because they just aren't the votes. And so we're walking away. So now we've got some interest from the Pittsburgh administration. Obviously, we've done a number of briefings there. We have a lot of support in the Black Caucus on this. Kim Lightford supports it. Will Davis supports it. Carol Amon supports it. Senator Martwick, who's really influential on tax policy, is very interested in it. And we are now working with Senator Martwick as a technical advisor on pension policy. So we are hopeful that sometime in the next year, whether done in veto session or lame duck or next legislative session, to actually get it done.